She could not sleep. None of them could. The woman sat in her tent, holding a letter she had written but would never send. It was addressed to her daughter, a girl of 7 who did not yet understand why her mother had left to fight in a war that seemed impossible to win. The letter said things mothers always say. I love you. Be strong. Remember me. But it also said something else. Something darker. If you are reading this, it means I did not come home. It means I died trying to stop them. The elephants. She had seen them 2 days ago when the Empire's army arrived in the valley below. 50 war elephants, each one as tall as a house. Each one carrying a tower on its back filled with archers. Each one trained to charge through enemy lines, trampling men like insects, crushing shields and bones, and hope beneath feet the size of tree stumps. For 300 years, no army had ever defeated the Empire's elephant corps in open battle. They were invincible, a force of nature wrapped in armor and fury. And tomorrow, at dawn, they would march up the mountain and destroy everything. The woman folded the letter, placed it in her armor, and whispered a prayer to gods she was not sure were listening. Let it be quick. Let it not hurt. Let my daughter remember me as brave, even if I die screaming. But she would not die at dawn. None of them would. Because in 4 hours, at exactly 3 in the morning, they were going to do something that history would call either genius or madness. They were going to charge straight into the heart of the elephant corps. Not at dawn, when battles were supposed to happen. Not with superior numbers or better weapons. But in the dead of night. With fire. With drums. With psychological terror. And they were going to turn those elephants into weapons that destroyed their own army. This is the story of how the invincible elephant corps was annihilated in a single night. Not by a superior force, but by desperation, ingenuity, and the understanding that even the strongest weapon can be turned against itself. And it begins with a commander who had nothing left to lose. The mountain kingdom was small, a collection of villages clinging to cliff sides, connected by narrow paths that were impossible for large armies to navigate. The people who lived there were farmers and herders, used to harsh winters and thin air. They were not warriors. They had no standing army, no tradition of conquest. For generations, they had been left alone, too remote and too poor to be worth invading. But the empire had changed. A new emperor had risen, one who believed that every inch of land should bow to his rule. And the mountains, with their strategic passes and their stubborn independence, were an insult to his vision. He sent an ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed. The mountain people sent back a simple message: no. And so the empire sent its army. 20,000 soldiers, engineers to build siege towers, cavalry to chase down anyone who tried to flee. And at the center of it all, the elephant corps. 50 war elephants, each one a walking fortress, each one a symbol of the empire's power. The message was clear. Resistance was not just futile, it was suicidal. The mountain kingdom could muster 3,000 fighters. Most of them had never been in a real battle. They had spears and bows, some old swords passed down through families, leather armor that would not stop a strong arrow. Against 20,000 imperial soldiers and 50 elephants, they had no chance. Everyone knew it. The elders argued for surrender. Better to live as subjects of the empire than to die as free men. But one voice disagreed. A commander who had once served in the empire's army before deserting. A woman who had seen the elephant corps in action, who had watched them crush rebel uprisings, who had studied their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses, and who understood something that the empire, in all its arrogance, had forgotten. Elephants are not machines. They are animals, and animals can be frightened. She stood before the assembled fighters, 3,000 men and women who looked at her with a mixture of hope and despair, and she told them the truth. We cannot win a fair fight. If we meet them at dawn, if we let them position their elephants and form their lines, we will all be dead before noon. But we are not going to fight fair. We are going to fight at night. We are going to attack when they are sleeping, when their guards are tired, when their elephants are resting. We are going to bring fire and noise and chaos. And we are going to make those elephants so terrified that they destroy their own army. Some of the fighters laughed. It was insane. Attack the elephant corps? At night? With what weapons? The commander smiled. Not weapons. Psychology. And then she explained the plan. The Empire's army had set up camp in the valley, confident and comfortable. They had posted guards, of course, but they were not expecting an attack. Why would they? The mountain people had 3,000 fighters against 20,000. They had no siege equipment, no cavalry, no chance. The elephants were kept in a corral at the center of the camp, surrounded by their handlers and trainers. The beasts were resting, chained loosely to allow them to move, but not to wander. They had been fed. They were calm. The Empire's generals slept in their tents, dreaming of the easy victory that would come at dawn. They did not post extra guards around the elephant corral. They did not think they needed to. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was underestimating what fear can do. At midnight, the mountain fighters began to move. Not all 3,000. Only 500. Cavalry. Riders on small mountain horses that were used to rough terrain and sudden movements. They moved slowly, carefully, down the mountain paths in complete silence. No torches, no talking, just the sound of hooves on stone, muffled by cloth wrapped around the horses' feet. They carried bundles strapped to their saddles, torches soaked in oil, drums, horns, and small clay pots filled with a mixture that would burn bright and hot and loud. They positioned themselves on 3 sides of the valley, staying in the shadows, waiting for the signal. The commander rode with them, her heart pounding, knowing that if this failed, if they were discovered too early, they would all die and the mountain kingdom would fall with them. But she also knew that if they did nothing, the result would be the same. So she waited, and at exactly 3 in the morning, she raised her hand and gave the order. Light the fires. 500 torches burst into flames simultaneously. The valley, which had been dark and quiet, suddenly exploded with light. And then came the noise. Drums. Not just a few. Hundreds of them, pounded in unison, creating a sound like thunder rolling through the valley. Horns blaring. Riders screaming war cries. And then, the clay pots. The riders hurled them into the air, toward the elephant corral. The pots shattered on impact, bursting into flames, creating explosions of light and sound that echoed off the valley walls. The Empire's soldiers woke in confusion. Where was the attack coming from? How many enemies were there? The light from the torches made it impossible to see clearly. The drums made it impossible to think. And in the center of the camp, the elephants began to panic. Elephants are intelligent creatures, but they are also prey animals. Despite their size, despite their strength, they have instincts that tell them to flee from danger. Fire is danger. Loud noises are danger. Chaos is danger. And suddenly, they were surrounded by all 3. The handlers tried to calm them. They shouted commands, pulled on chains, did everything they had been trained to do. But the elephants were not listening. The first one to break free was a bull, one of the largest in the corps. He reared up, trumpeting in terror, and brought his front feet down on a handler who had been trying to restrain him. The man died instantly, crushed beneath tons of muscle and bone. The other elephants saw him break free and followed. Chains snapped. Posts were torn from the ground. And 50 terrified war elephants began to stampede. They did not stampede toward the enemy. They stampeded in every direction. Through the camp. Through the tents where soldiers were sleeping. Through the supply lines. Through the command tents where generals were trying to organize a response. An elephant in full panic is unstoppable. It does not care what is in its path. It will go through walls, through people, through anything. And these were war elephants, trained to charge and destroy. Except now, they were charging through their own army. Soldiers woke to find elephants crashing through their tents. They tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The valley was narrow, surrounded by mountains on both sides. The stampede turned the camp into a killing ground. Men were trampled, crushed, thrown through the air. The towers on the elephants' backs collapsed, spilling archers onto the ground where they were trampled by the very beasts they were supposed to ride. And the noise, the screaming of men, the trumpeting of elephants, the thunder of massive feet pounding the earth. It was chaos, pure, uncontrolled chaos. The mountain cavalry did not enter the camp. They did not need to. They stayed on the edges, throwing more fire pots, beating more drums, keeping the elephants terrified and moving. Every time an elephant started to calm down, Another explosion of light and sound sent it into a fresh panic. The commander watched from a hillside, her face lit by the fires below, and she felt no joy, only relief. The plan was working, but she also knew what was happening down there. People were dying, not just soldiers, handlers who had raised those elephants from birth, cooks and engineers, and supply workers who had nothing to do with the decision to invade. War does not discriminate. When chaos is unleashed, it consumes everyone. And she had unleashed it. She would carry that weight for the rest of her life. But she would carry it as a free woman in a free kingdom. And that, she told herself, made it worth it. The stampede lasted for an hour. By the time the elephants finally exhausted themselves and began to calm, the Empire's camp was destroyed. Tents were flattened. Supply wagons were overturned and burning. Thousands of soldiers were dead or injured, crushed beneath elephant feet or caught in the chaos. The elephant core itself was shattered. Some of the beasts had run so far they disappeared into the mountains and were never recovered. Others collapsed from exhaustion, their hearts giving out from the panic. A few had been injured by the fire pots or by colliding with each other in the darkness. The handlers who survived were in shock, unable to process what had happened. The generals, those who had not been killed in the stampede, stumbled out of the wreckage and tried to assess the damage. What they saw broke them. The invincible elephant core, the pride of the Empire, the weapon that had never been defeated in 300 years, was gone. Not defeated in battle, destroyed by its own panic. At dawn, when the Empire's soldiers finally managed to form some kind of order, they looked up at the mountains and saw the mountain fighters standing in formation. 3,000 of them, lined up along the ridges, waiting. The Empire had lost more than half its force in the night. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized, leaderless. And they were staring up at an enemy that had just proven it could turn the Empire's greatest weapon against itself. The remaining generals called for a retreat. There was no debate, no argument. They gathered what was left of their army and marched away, leaving behind the bodies of their dead and the broken remnants of the elephant core. The Mountain Kingdom had won, not through superior strength, not through better weapons, but through understanding that power is only as stable as the control you have over it. And when that control breaks, power becomes destruction. News of the defeat spread like wildfire across the Empire. The unbeatable elephant core had been annihilated. Not by another empire, not by a massive army, but by a few hundred mountain fighters with torches and drums. The emperor was furious. He demanded to know how this had happened. He executed the surviving generals for incompetence. He ordered the elephant training program to be overhauled, to find ways to prevent panic. But it was too late. The myth was broken. Every enemy of the empire, every rebel group, every kingdom that had been paying tribute out of fear, they all heard the story. And they all realized the same thing. The elephants could be beaten. The invincible weapon was not invincible. And if the elephants could fall, then maybe the empire could fall too. Within a decade, the empire faced 3 major rebellions, all of them inspired by the Midnight Charge. Rebel groups studied the tactics, refined them, found new ways to terrify war elephants. Fire arrows, spiked obstacles, loud instruments played in coordinated assaults. The empire tried to adapt. They trained the elephants to be less sensitive to noise and fire. They increased the number of handlers. They changed their battle formations. But the damage was done. The psychological edge was gone. Armies no longer feared the elephants. And without that fear, the beasts were just large, slow targets that required massive resources to maintain. One by one, the empire's client states stopped paying tribute. Border regions declared independence. And the empire, which had seemed eternal, began to crumble. The woman who had commanded the Midnight Charge became a legend. Songs were written about her. Statues were carved. Children were taught her name in schools. But she did not feel like a hero. She had survived the battle, but many of her riders had not. Some had been caught by imperial cavalry during the retreat. Others had been thrown from their horses in the chaos. And she remembered every one of their names. She kept a list, written in a journal she carried everywhere. And every night, before she slept, she read their names aloud. A ritual, a penance, a reminder that victory is always paid for in blood. She lived to be an old woman, long enough to see the empire collapse completely, to see her mountain kingdom become a symbol of resistance. But she never celebrated. She never boasted. When people asked her how she felt about what she had done, she always gave the same answer. I feel tired. The elephants that survived the stampede were eventually recovered. Some were returned to the wild. Others were kept by the mountain people, retrained as work animals, used to carry supplies and help with construction. The handlers who had raised them, those who had survived, they mourned. To them, the elephants were not weapons. They were companions, creatures they had known since birth, who they had trained and cared for and loved. And they had been forced to watch as those creatures were turned into instruments of destruction against their own people. One handler, an old man who had worked with elephants for 40 years, said something that was recorded by a historian who interviewed survivors. He said, "We did not lose the battle because the elephants failed. We lost because we forgot that they were alive. We treated them like weapons. And when you treat a living thing like a weapon, eventually it will break. Or it will turn on you." That statement became the epitome of what happened that night. The empire had built its power on the assumption that force could be controlled, directed, maintained indefinitely. That war elephants were just tools, like swords or siege towers. They had forgotten that elephants feel fear, that they can be overwhelmed, that they are not machines, and that forgetting cost them everything. The Midnight Charge did not just destroy the elephant core. It destroyed the philosophy behind it. It proved that no matter how powerful a weapon is, it can always be turned against you if you do not understand its nature. And that lesson, more than the battle itself, changed the course of history. Today, military historians study the Midnight Charge as a masterclass in psychological warfare. They analyze the timing, the use of fire and sound, the coordination required to execute the plan. They call it brilliant, innovative, a turning point in the use of terror tactics. But they often miss the human element. They do not talk about the woman who wrote a letter to her daughter that she thought would be her last words. They do not talk about the handlers who watched their elephants destroy their own army. They do not talk about the soldiers who were crushed in their sleep, who never had a chance to fight or flee. They focus on the tactics, on the strategy, on the results. But war is not just tactics. It is people, living, breathing, feeling people who are caught in a machine that grinds them up and spits out results that historians will analyze centuries later. The Midnight Charge ended the myth of the invincible elephant core, but it also created a new myth. The myth of the unstoppable underdog. The idea that with enough cleverness, enough desperation, enough willingness to take risks, a small force can defeat a large one. And that myth is both true and dangerous. It is true because history is full of examples where innovation and psychological warfare overcame superior numbers. But it is dangerous because it makes us forget the cost. It makes us forget that for every successful Midnight Charge, there are 100 failed ones. There are 100 commanders who tried the same tactic and died. 100 small kingdoms that resisted empires and were wiped from the map. We remember the victories. We forget the failures. And that creates a distorted view of what resistance actually looks like. The woman who commanded the charge understood this. That is why she never celebrated. That is why she read the names of the dead every night. Because she knew that she had been lucky. That if the wind had shifted and carried the sound away, if the elephants had been chained more securely, if the empire had posted more guards, the plan would have failed. And she and everyone who followed her would have died. She had gambled with lives, her own and others, and she had won. But she never forgot that it was a gamble. That victory was not guaranteed by cleverness or courage. That sometimes the only difference between a legend and a tragedy is luck. And luck is not something you can control. The empire eventually fell, its territories divided among successor states, its legacy reduced to ruins and stories. The elephant core was never rebuilt. The few elephants that remained were symbols of a bygone era, relics of a time when size and strength seemed like enough. But the lesson of the Midnight Charge lived on, not just in military academies, where tacticians studied the use of psychological warfare, but in the hearts of people who lived under oppression, who looked at empires and saw not invincibility, but vulnerability, who understood that every system, no matter how powerful, has a weakness. And that sometimes all it takes to bring that system down is the courage to strike at 3 in the morning, when the guards are tired and the elephants are sleeping. The letter the woman wrote to her daughter, the one she thought would be her last words, it was never sent. She survived. She went home, and she gave it to her daughter in person, years later, when the girl was old enough to understand what it meant. The daughter read it and cried, not because her mother had almost died, but because she realized how close she had come to growing up without her. How many other daughters had read similar letters, written by mothers and fathers who did not come home? How many families had been broken so that kingdoms could remain free? And she understood, in a way that history books never capture, that freedom is not free. It is purchased with blood and fear and sleepless nights, with letters that are written but never sent, with names that are read aloud in the darkness, over and over, until the reader dies and the names are forgotten. This is the story of how a midnight charge destroyed the invincible elephant corps, of how desperation and ingenuity overcame strength and tradition, of how 50 war elephants, turned into instruments of terror, destroyed the very army they were meant to protect. But it is also the story of the cost, the handlers who lost their companions, the soldiers who died in the chaos, the commander who carried the weight of her decision for the rest of her life. Because victory, no matter how brilliant, no matter how necessary, is always paid for. Always. And the currency is not gold or territory. It is lives. Human lives. Elephant lives. Lives that mattered to someone, somewhere. Lives that were spent in a single night, in a valley far from home, beneath a sky lit by fire and filled with the sound of drums and screaming and thunder. The empire fell. The mountain kingdom survived, and history recorded it as a triumph. But the woman who made it happen, she knew the truth. There are no triumphs in war, only survivors, and the ghosts of those who were not so lucky.